All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking time to join us today. So today's topic is all around digitalization. So every organization in some form or fashion today is embarking on either a digital initiative or on a cloud-first journey, or there are compliance imperatives that organizations are facing. So what we thought was this topic would be very relevant if you are embarking on either of those three journeys. And what we have here with us is an esteemed panel from E&Y. Kaushal, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure.
There is mine.
Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. Kosha Patel, part of the EY team, as Amit mentioned. I had the honor of working with a number of the Saviynt folks since the early start of the institution of the digital, as well as a number of other IGA capabilities. My role within EY is a number of things. First is essentially advisor to several sectors across Americas, and second is to run the digital IAM practice across America. So I do have the other champions with me here, Atul and Avdesh. We're going to talk to you this afternoon about a number of use cases, specifically within the digital transformation erupting out of our media and entertainment sector, as well as some of the power and utilities.
Thank you. So a very quick background about Saviynt. Saviynt focuses on access, governance, and intelligence services, right? Our whole philosophy here is that if an organization wants to really use identity, take it to the next level, use that to really drive security and compliance management in an organization, that's what Saviynt is here for you. The second thing that Saviynt has been focusing on is really changing the discussion of identity governance and administration from being something that needs heavy customization, that needs to be deployed on-prem, to taking that journey to how do we really solve business problems and take away the complexity of deploying things, deploying code, customizing it from an on-prem standpoint, right? So that's one of our philosophies. And we have a great partner with us, E&Y, who has again taken a very similar approach in terms of making a solution out of it, using Saviynt as one of the solutions as part of the digital transformation journeys, and taking that to our customers so that they can derive business value very quickly, and it's a faster time to market from that standpoint. So like I said, there are three primary focus from a Saviynt as well as from an EY standpoint. The first and foremost is digitalization as an initiative, and Kaushal will chime in terms of what are some of the business use cases that he's seeing in the two industries. What does digitalization look for from their perspective? Because each industry, each organization has a completely different meaning of what digitalization means, right? And again, there is not a very simple plug-and-play solution that can be evolved out of here. But again, some of the complexity has been addressed by Kaushal's team. So Kaushal, do you want to quickly touch upon some of the digital initiatives?
Sure, Amit, thank you. And some of our experiences coming out of the two sectors primarily has been around, when we look at the processes, we look at the business experience of the things. One of the core capabilities of what IGA components provides us is to really drive the authorizations and authentication provisioning capabilities, right? With regards to ensuring we are making a seamless user experience when it comes to the user registrations, the adaptive profiles. We'll talk a little bit about the solutioning specific to how IGA is helping us to advance into that arena. And then third is accelerating the business growth from the perspective of the time to market from the technology set that Saviynt offers in its key components of the digital stack, right? So we'll talk a little bit about the customer ID stores. We'll speak to the portal authorization aspect. And then lastly, but not least, the overall seamless user experience that we want to extend out as a broader solutioning offering.
Okay. Thanks, Kaushal. So on that line, right, so what we wanted to do was really walk you through a very high-level architecture. Obviously, this is highly simplified. So, obviously, every customer, every organization will have a lot of nuances into this architecture, right? But at a very high level, just to level set the terminologies that we will be using through the session today, would be primarily focusing on access management, which should be obviously something like Ping, or there are other technologies out there like ForgeRock or Okta, which allow you to do single sign-on federation so that users can have a seamless access. And apart from that, there are other technologies augmenting that more around device management, how you enable BYOD, how do you drive multi-factor authentication, so on and so forth, right? The second aspect of the solution primarily focuses on identity governance and administration, which is what is covered under the Saviynt portfolio, and we will delve a little bit more deeper into that. And then there are various other moving parts when it comes to how do you have an identity store, how do you build the next generation or a newer model of identity store that addresses some of the scalability requirements, and Kaushal and team will touch upon that as well, right? So these are some of the high-level components that we have seen in all our customers. So what does the customer or digital identity and access management platform solve for an organization, right? So we have kind of broken it down into 3 primary tenants, starting with the first one, which is all around how do we empower our end user, right? Any digital initiative is going to cater to my B2C or my end customers. It might cater to my business partners, who in turn need to manage my customers, or they could be just third-party partners that I need to do the whole identity management and administration part of it, right? So some of the key tenets that we really are following as part of our solution framework revolve around how do we enable our end users to perform a lot of self-service functionality, right? So that means it lowers the TCO and the amount of time or the operational staff that you have to put in place to cater to the identity management requirements of that kind of an audience, right? So how do I simplify and automate things like identity registration? How do I enable them with password reset capabilities, so on and so forth? So there are a whole bunch of capabilities that we will touch upon it, right? But apart from that, what we also want to bring in this empowerment is not lose sight of the whole philosophy around risk, and that has to be foremost when we talk about empowering our end users, right? We don't want to leave an open gate for any customer to walk in and access my critical services, but rather I want to take a phased approach or a risk-based approach where, based on the type of resource, I have associated a level of assurance, and that level of assurance in turn drives what kind of verification, what kind of validation, what kind of authentication should I perform so that the user can consume that service or the data or perform a transaction that is associated with that level of assurance. So team, do you want to touch upon that?
Absolutely. I would like to highlight on the self-service part. Traditionally, the thought process about self-service has been like, how can I reset my password? That's the maximum what people have thought about, and updating some of the other key profile attributes like last name and so on. But if you look at some of the evolving industry, hospitality, cruising and all that, those self-service pieces have gone beyond the basic profile and has gone into preferences like what time am I going to be dining in, at which particular restaurant, so that my reservation can be made, at which particular location I prefer to be in a hotel or in a flight. So those preferences are all self-driven, and personalization and delivering what the customer wants is such a key piece. So if you think about unifying the identity and giving that power to the customer that they can decide and choose and change it based on future conditions and all that, you're giving a solution out there which can be personalized and delivered to the customer, changing demographics, taste and all that, right? So in the digitalization, what we have to ensure is that we are mind sharing, we are giving or empowering the customer to scale with all the changes which are happening. And along with that, the rest of the pieces like security and all has to be integrated and implemented.
So one of the key aspects as part of this self-registration is, like I said, how do we drive this level of assurance, and based on that we drive the security management, right? So this is a very, again, a very abstracted, high-level chart that we have put together. So the intent here is that all these different services, whether it is the preference or the subscription management or whatever product, right, that you are exposing to the end users, These are all provided as part of your portal services, right? So I'm not talking about just one portal as a system, but rather a portal services, because everyone is moving towards a federated model, right? I might have some sort of a bill payment which I'm getting from another one third party versus scheduling system which is coming from a completely different third party, but I'm aggregating all of it and delivering as part of my portal services, right? So now, first and foremost, what we need to do as part of this initiative is to apply a level of assurance based on these services that a user is consuming, or it could be data, or it could be transactions, right? So, Atul talked about the cruising industry or the travel industry, right? Similarly, if I take that to a banking or a treasury portal, it would mean that, can I associate a level of assurance with the dollar amount that a person can check out of their, move out of their check-in account, or they can transfer it to a different organization, right? And that amount in turn drives the level of assurance. And what we are doing as part of that level of assurance is to embed a couple of things. First is what we call as identity proofing. And again, you will see this more and more implied and implicit and baked into any kind of digital initiative. Because at the end of the day, what we have learned from our customers is onboarding a user has to be very simple, right? Now that means that you are going to ask for bare minimum questions for the user: first name, last name, email address, or there is nowadays a very simple button says that, do I reuse my Facebook or Twitter ID to register, right? So onboarding of a customer, because it has been simplified to that extent, right? Obviously, I cannot take that identity and then drive a lot of financial or high-risk transactions with the same identity, right? So what we have come up with the model is that how do we then do an inline escalation of the level of assurance based on the type of service that the user is trying to access or the type of transaction that the user is performing. You then inline perform what we call as identity proofing. So that means as part of that, then we have listed out some of the ID proofing vendors that you might see in the industry, whether it is LexisNexis, or if you are an insurance company, then it could be your policy number associated with your 4 digits of your social security number, right? We can take any of these ID proofing mechanisms and then apply that to different level of assurances, so that we then can verify whether this person, the Facebook ID that has been provided to me, is the right person who also owns this particular policy, so on and so forth, right? And again, this level of assurance, the model way it has been built out is that it is completely flexible. So depending on the type of industry that you are, you can define your own risk model, your own level of assurance model, and hence the ID proofing technology that you will use. Okay. Apart from ID proofing, which is again driven based on risk, we also then have to support provisioning of the user's access in the backend. Because once I register, whether it's OAuth based authentication or OpenID based, right? At the end of the day, I still need to go and create a single sign-on ID, whether it is in Ping or ForgeRock or whatever, associate that user, enable that user, set up a multi-factor authentication, those kind of things, right? As well as we also have to take into account failure scenarios. So what happens if a registration fails or an ID proofing fails, right? You don't want to refuse the customer, but rather you want to open up a case management ticket so that your customer service representative can proactively reach out to the customer and provide the support that they need so that they can consume that service, right? So any points you want to add to this?
Yeah, absolutely. Identity proofing is changing pretty fast too. Like if you remember the IRS scam which happened about 3 years back, where a lot of people's old tax filing data was leaked. So now one of the ways most of the time people are able to breach data is by giving the SSN, the address and all, which is normally used for identity validations before you disclose the information. Now considering that, where the industry is evolving is more on the implicit side of the business, where you are looking at the devices and mapping it to person's identity, and if they don't match, then you escalate and get into step up the authentication. So as an industry, even the identity validation and verification is moving from a very explicit to implicit, considering the balance of usability and the security too. So in a way, we are moving towards smarter and intelligent way of identity proofing?
Excellent points. All right. The second tenant in any digital initiative would be scale. Right now, it goes without saying that moment we are talking about B2C customers, usually we will talk about something which is unlike a traditional IDM, right? Enterprise IDM, you will refer to anything between 2,000 to 5,000 to even 100,000 internal employees. But that's not the case when it comes to an identity management system that has to cater to your B2C kind of users, right? Because here we are talking about 500,000, 1 million, or 10 million upwards kind of users that need to be managed as part of the identity solution, right? So one of the key things that need to be accounted for is how do I build a solution that can be also delivered and maintained current from a cloud standpoint, right? So what I mean by that is not a literal way of that this solution has to be deployed on cloud, but rather learn from how a cloud technology is implemented today in an organization, right? So which is nothing but the whole CI/CD process, continuous innovation, continuous delivery process. How do you build that pipeline so that you can deliver the services, start off at a lower scale. It could be services that are delivered at a lower volume or a lower set of users, and then you amp up as you go through the rollout, right? So the whole framework has to support all those aspects. The second thing is when it comes to from a cloud standpoint, right? Another thing that we have learned is to adopt a very services-oriented model, and that's one of the digital artifacts that we want to bring to the table and adopt that kind of an architecture so that you can again innovate quickly, integrate different components quickly, and achieve the scale, the elasticity that you would expect to support a 5 or a 10 million user organization.
And I think, Amit, this kind of goes back to the time to market and accelerated business growth concepts that you just brought up earlier in the conversation, right? With respect to microservices, it gives us an ability to expedite the overall service transactions that are required to connect to your authentications, authorizations, or governance endpoints. And both of the experiences here, one on the power utility and the cruise line, will sort of share the perspectives of what that implementation has looked like, and essentially the business benefits of going towards a microservices route as opposed to your traditional service bus concept that really expedites your transaction delivery time to the single endpoint. So I think of this we can speak to the power grid scenario, and then Atul, maybe you can speak on the cruise line microservices.
Sure, thanks, Kaushal. So as both the guys mentioned, right, I mean, when we are talking about external users or external, adapting components, it is really important that, it is flexible, it is easy, and it is also something that can be adapted by various, small units. So making it more real to the power and utility sector. Within power and utility, it is really, really important from a regulation perspective, as well as people on the ground who are actually dealing with the actual grids, power units, turbines, and also, switches, to know what they can actually make a decision and then, make the switch at the same time, because it is basically going to be the same set of people who will be operating from one power grid to other power grid. So, currently their access becomes difficult, so they have to be the same people moving to different power grids within a state or within a city to actually make the switch, because that is where their access is given. But with identity proofing and with microservices, one of the things that we want to enable the power and utility sector is basically, having the same set of people who are at the ground in those particular power grids to be able to make those decisions without being dependent on these particular set of people deployed to make the switch. So that is being enabled through identity proofing. And now to make it happen, these decisions, we want to leverage microservices in the background so that it becomes really easy to integrate with the right set of applications, and then make it more flexible, and then quickly switch over if the decision capability in the backend needs to be changed. And then with that, also to add to the point, delegation becomes easy. Microservices will allow us to basically not get dependent on the policy making, decision making capability or the engine, versus actually depending on some analytics which will basically be driven through various data process between the actual behavior of what access has been given versus what has been stored within these data in the backend. So That's kind of a little example from a power utility perspective.
Sure.
Great point, Avdesh. On the power utility side, overall, if you look at the architecture of newer technology set in the digital space, such as microservices, the architecture is not there even. Like if you look at some of the benchmark solution like Netflix and all, with the Chaos Monkey and all, there is no real architecture, rather it has to scale and all with elasticity. So how do you really do that to a specific industry where it can scale, it can perform, it is highly available and all, is the challenge. And that's where when we are solving it for cruise line and some of the other industry, we are thinking about the solution not only being available in one footprint, but also in a disjointed mode. Let's say when the cruise is not even connected, how the services are going to be scaling. And the beauty of microservices, as it is so autonomous in their space with their own data and all that, they are able to perform even when the things like basic things like connectivity is not there. So some of this advanced technology is enabling those scenarios of cruising or the airlines, which can be very much in a connected or disconnected mode, and the technology is enabling us, and where we are able to leverage and create services wherein like identity and access management services are being created and deployed very much as a microservice too. And that's the part which we have solved.
Yep, great points. And just to kind of visualize this, right? So again, this is a very oversimplified architecture. But what we are trying to solve here is first and foremost is to create a central view of a user's identity. And now for that, what we have been using overall as a solution is a set of virtual directory service provider, right, model, where instead of having one single LDAP and having all my customer accounts and entitlements being stored in one, instead of that, rather I'm piecemealing all the different the whole user profile from different sources. So that could mean attribute A comes from one LDAP, attribute B comes from a particular database, aggregate all of that view and render it as part of the whole microservice architecture, right? So once I have that consolidated view of the user, then you start implementing and enforcing all your identity governance, access management, and identity management processes on top of it. So what that means is, first of all, from an architecture standpoint, one of the key things that we have done from an identity management standpoint is that a traditional IDM vendor relies heavily on reconciliation. Some of you might be aware that an IDM technology requires you to reconcile or have a copy of the managed systems data into the local repository of the IDM system itself, so that it can perform addition of access, removal of access locally, and then it synchronizes that data back into the managed system, right? Whether it's a database or a directory. Now, when we're talking about millions of users, obviously reconciliation does not scale well in that context, because by the time I have copied or made a replica of my millions of users record into the local IDM repository itself, the data on the other side has gone out of sync, right? Maybe the risk value of the user has changed, maybe the attribute of the user has changed based on which some other IDM policy would have been driven off, right? So one of the things that we have devised as a solution is to have a completely data sparse model when it comes to identity management. And what that means is, whenever you are going to embark on a user identity change service function, right, whether it's addition of the access or deletion of access or modification of access or attribute of the user, we fetch the user's record on the fly from the directory, from the virtualized directory services, which in turn sources it from different places and shows you the user record. The end user or the administrator then performs whatever identity lifecycle services they want to do or functions they want to do, and then that change gets pushed out in real time. And again, no scheduled tasks, no reconciling, right? Everything gets pushed down in real time back to the repository. Now that model allows you to really scale and as well as ensure that whether the services is offline, like in the cruise ship model, then it has a local snapshot and that's where the services are happening. And once it docks back to the onshore system, you synchronize back the changes, right? So the whole virtual directory kind of model allows you to do that, as well as the data sparse model allows you to kind of scale that whole framework, okay? And one more thing that we have also tried to solve here is the whole provisioning of legacy systems, right? Another thing is that, obviously virtual directory that we are standing up here is more for the new portal services that we are launching, that you are launching here as part of the digital initiative. But then obviously there are legacy systems that also need to be provisioned, right? And again, we are trying to move away from the traditional model of having a connector-based architecture, where I need to have a connector for database, I need to have a connector for, a directory or whatever it is, right? Instead of that, rather rely on a pub-sub model. And if you want to chime on that, some of the benefits.
Absolutely. I mean, one key thing which Amit highlighted and we completely agree is any architecture which you put in this digital transformation or the major overall of your stack is you want to minimize the data footprint, especially from the data which is authoritative in nature. And with this architecture, as you will notice, although you are putting an identity governance, administration, and some of the most powerful system, you are still not adding on to the footprint of authoritative source. Rather, in the center, as you can see with the triangle, we are putting a virtual directory services, which is centralizing the entire authoritative source, so that when you have to scale, you have to be nimble, and you have to make it a fault-tolerant system, you are able to do that. So the idea is to minimize the footprint so that you can scale. And whenever required, you can always go and provision it to any of the legacy systems such as AS400 and all, which are not so good with synchronous call and so on. So essentially, wherever required, you can go into a very decentralized mode by provisioning the data so that they can run within their own context without making external call, which to some extent comes into a microservice architecture, which becomes a slightly different ballgame, but essentially you are creating a scalable solution for different scenario and to support both legacy and modern technology in your enterprise stack.
Thank you. And the third aspect obviously is around security, right? So we already talked about security to some extent as part of the level of assurance, the risk-based adaptive authentication, right? So now to take that forward, also what we are trying to tap into is the evolution of technology as it comes to analytics, right? Many of you would have heard about security analytics, user behavior analytics. The intent here is that as we are making things more accessible to the end user, we still need to keep an eye on them in terms of what their activity they are doing and identify upfront whether the activity is malicious or not, right? And if it is malicious, then how do we act on top of it? How do we ensure that the damage that could be potentially caused by that user is limited, right? So as part of that, we are trying to bring in this whole model around level of assurance that in turn drives the trust model within the microservices and how the services are exposed and consumed, make it more context aware. Again, tying back to which device am I coming in from, using that context to drive policies, right? So we have got few customers who also want to ensure that if I'm coming in from my approved BYOD device, or if I'm coming from my VPN environment, then I can access a particular resource. But if I'm coming outside of that zone from a internet or a public internet, then I don't get access, or I get limited functionality within the same application, right? So some of those context, how do you bring in and apply it to your digital initiative will also be critical. You want to chime into that?
Yeah, I can add it to that. And again, this all is like, if you look at now how the security is coming into picture, because that's kind of the most primary component of it. But as we just saw the journey, the key here is centralization. So, we have the data centralization, leveraging microservices, performing identity proofing. So as, we just heard from Amit that, it is really important that now we are enabling people to get access. It is important that they only get access what, they need, and they're not doing anything really weird. And it again, kind of bringing it to the context of power and utility, it is really, really important. Even, now it is just not the internal or the external users, because here is where you're exposing people to have access to play around with nuclear power plants or turbine power plants, or have access, which could have a drastic change on the end users. So with this particular piece of analysis, we kind of always monitor that, people who are accessing information are accessing from particular locations, but not from different locations. So obviously somebody who's taking action on a power grid or actually enabling any transformation of power from one transmission unit to another one cannot do that sitting in, let's say, Europe, if that is to do with North America's power grid. So those kind of analysis are enabled by this particular centralization and analysis that has been empowered by the whole concept of microservices. So.
And I'll just build upon what Avdesh said. I think typically in the digitalization concept that we're having a discussion on is essentially what we're beginning to see in the industry is a convergence towards sort of the policy-based access control. I think most of us has lived through the era of role-based access and attribute-based access control. But what we're beginning to see in the digital transformation side of the world is a lot of the emergence towards the policy-based access control, driving some of the decisioning through the policies as opposed to the low-case, granular activities of the entitlements.
Yep. Yeah, I think the centralized policy enforcement, or rather federated policy enforcement, which is driven using a flexible centralized policy administration piece, is again essential part of the overall architecture, right? And last but not the least, wanted to kind of tie it back to one of the aspects that we talked about, behavior analytics, right? So again, this is oversimplification of the complexity that goes behind the scenes to really identify what is a malicious behavior versus not, right? So there is no single bullet here. You have to rely on multiple algorithms, multiple deviations from an end user standpoint, as well as move it more towards an entity-based model, right? So that's why the whole philosophy has now moved away from just being a user behavior analytics to a user and entity behavior analytics, right? Where we are looking at not only whether the user is performing something malicious, but also because we are using microservices, right? Whether the service itself is behaving in the appropriate manner or not, right? So bringing in the context of entity. And at the end of the day, we are applying different algorithms, whether there is a volume spike or a deviation between the user or entity's past behavior versus what activity they are performing today, or whether it's a rare event, like a person never used to log in, or an administrator never used to log in and perform so-and-so portal transactions in the off hours, but suddenly I see that activity happening, and again, maybe from a completely different geo-IP location, right? So again, looking at those rare events, looking at those frequency spikes, right? Or comparing your access vis-a-vis your peers' access. All these different algorithms have been brought together to drive and establish the user and entity behavior analytics that in turn allows you to drive the adaptive or the risk-based authentication, do the step-up multi-factor authentication at that point in time, as well as drive some of the context-based access policies at a fine-grained level. So just to kind of summarize, right, what we have done is slightly moved away from oversimplification to simplification now in terms of the service-oriented architecture, right? So this is what, at a high level, a customer identity and access management architecture looks like, where you have a whole bunch of services that are exposed and managed by the identity governance provider, and then there are the token services or the federation services or the device validation services that are provided by the access management platform, right? And all of this have to come together and basically service the portal services, which is then going to interact with the end user, or it could be the administrator, which would be the portal administrator in that case, or it could be your B2B, that's the business partner who is in turn managing your customers, right? So it could be a whole set of different users, and you have a persona-based and a context-aware security policy that is enforced as part of the identity management or the digital identity management initiative. Okay. Anything else you wanted to add in terms of case study?
I think from our perspective, from the digital transformation side, Amit, definitely a lot of sort of transformation with respect to the changes we're seeing, not only on the technology front, but also on the business side. And what we've learned through the experiences of both of these implementations is essentially digital transformation's core purpose is to accelerate your business growth, improve the time to market, lower your cost, and more importantly, build an environment of a continuous improvement culture, right? So essentially, the architecture blueprint that you sort of laid out here this afternoon leads us towards there. We've also been able to see collectively through the number of products in the ecosystem that are driving us towards meeting these objectives set by the business, driving towards more simplicity when it comes to the user registrations. Knowing more about your customer allows us to have more personalization services, and through microservices, it allows us to have those services in the market at a much quicker, rapid pace.
We'll open it for questions.
Yeah. So also wanted to open the forum up for any questions that you might have and that the panel can address today. And we might have to pass on the mic. Nabil, you want to grab the mic? Pass it over.
So I'm a true believer in microservices, love it. I agree with you, that's a key to being able to support digital transformation use cases with an IAM solution. But microservices is not just at the API level. In order to allow a solution to evolve, it has to be all the way back to the code base. You can't have a microservices API level in front of a monolithic code base and really be microservices. So can you speak to the extent to which you've implemented microservices in your solution?
Sure.
Does it go beyond the API level? Is it really all the way back to the code base so that your code is componentized and you have different code components that are providing those microservices?
Absolutely. Great question, right? And I think a valid point, right? Microservices tends to be a buzzword, right? Obviously, it's the newest fad out there. However, I think the proof is in the pudding, right? At the end of the day, what you are expecting the microservice to really deliver are the tenants which we talked about, right? Whether it is scalability, the extensibility, how you can deliver a service in an incremental fashion, right? So you can deliver those point services. Maybe just a lookup of a user would be a microservice that is enabled at a point in time. Modifying that user's profile is another microservice that is exposed at a point in time. So unless you adopt it to the core, right, across your platform, then you really cannot deliver the scale or the agility that is expected. So what we have done from our product standpoint, obviously, because of our cloud-hosted, cloud-architected model, we have embraced it completely in our architecture. So not only it's a API facade that is exposed to the end users, but rather we have built the modularity in terms of different functions, right? So whether it's in terms of driving the analytics, driving the reporting, all of those are separate independent microservices that can be ramped up, ramped down based on scale. Because one of the things that we also want to be aware about is, we are on the cloud, right? So we are bearing the expense of hosting and operating the overall platform in many cases, right? So obviously we want to optimize it. So only when you have a process or a scheduled job which runs maybe a report that is going to scan through my database and churn out a report, I will launch that microservice, execute it, and after that it dies away, that instance dies away, right? So again, we have to fully embrace it, otherwise, you really can't deliver to the scale and the extensibility promises that we are talking about here. Okay. Kosha, you wanted to chime into that from an overall microservices architecture?
I'm good. Go ahead. Yeah. Sure. Great point. A lot of people think that microservices are the new API or the services, but that's not how it should be thought about. Rather, you are decomposing your business functions into individual services which are very self-contained. So whether you are looking at booking as a service or looking at different options of what cruises I can take, those are all independent, self-contained services with their own set of validations, with the workflow, with their data and all that. Everything's self-contained. And and they're very fault tolerant too. In case, like to Amit's point, as it is in the cloud with the 24/7, whether you are in a continuous integration build or if one of the services goes down, you are monitoring the health and then the service, like via the registry, things are coming. So if you open that Pandora box and look at the architecture, it is way different than what an API gateway or a management service will provide versus a Docker or a container for the microservices. Two different worlds altogether. And microservices are more business driven. API is about how I'm going to expose the data to some of the third parties. Right? Two different contexts.
Yep. Thanks. Any other questions from the audience? All right. Okay. All right. With that, we are available here for if there are any other questions that you want to get answered, or if you want to deep dive into any of the case studies that we kind of alluded to today. We are here. And thank you very much for all your attendance today. Thank you.